The gasps echoed through St. Teresa's when Miguel's boot connected with the Virgin Mary altar. His grandmother, Rosa, dropped her rosary beads, the wooden cross clattering against the marble floor as 23 years of her daily prayers seemed to shatter in that single moment of desecration. "You think this statue is going to fix anything?" Miguel shouted at his weeping mother Elena, his voice carrying across the sacred space where 3 generations of his family had knelt in worship. The blue-robed figure of Mary gazed down serenely despite the violence, her painted eyes holding a patience that made Miguel even angrier. Father Martinez rushed forward from the confessional, his weathered face pale with shock. Behind him, Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her husband's arm, both longtime parishioners frozen in disbelief at witnessing such sacrilege in their beloved sanctuary. Miguel's steel-toed work boot had left a deep scratch across the base of the altar where offerings of flowers and candles usually rested in peaceful devotion. Now rose petals scattered across the floor like drops of blood, and the eternal flame flickered as if struggling to remain lit in the presence of such anger and pain. The whispers followed Elena everywhere she went in the weeks after Miguel's desecration. At Garcia's market, conversations stopped when she entered. The pharmacist avoided her eyes when filling Rosa's heart medication. Even her closest friend, Patricia, crossed the street rather than face the shame of what Elena's son had done to their sacred space. Miguel seemed to thrive on the notoriety. He showed up drunk to Sunday Mass, sitting in the back pew with his arms crossed, smirking as Father Martinez struggled through his homily about forgiveness. When the collection basket passed, Miguel dropped in a crumpled beer can instead of money, the metallic clang echoing through the horrified silence. "Your grandmother is dying because of your sins," Elena whispered desperately after yet another sleepless night at Rosa's bedside. The old woman's breathing had grown shallow, her once strong hands now translucent against the white hospital sheets. Miguel laughed bitterly. That statue didn't protect her, did it? All those years of prayers and devotion. And where is your precious Mary now? His words cut deeper than his boot had damaged the altar, leaving wounds in his mother's heart that seemed impossible to heal. The machines beeped steadily in Rosa's hospital room as her family gathered for what the doctors warned might be their final goodbye. Elena clutched her mother's weathered hand while Miguel's father Robert stood rigid against the far wall, his construction-hardened face etched with grief and anger that refused to soften even in these desperate hours. "She's been asking for Miguel all night," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "She keeps saying his name and reaching toward the door like she's waiting for someone who will never come." Robert's jaw tightened. He made his choice when he kicked that altar. Some things can't be forgiven, Elena. Some sins are too great. But Rosa's eyes fluttered open just then, searching the room with the clarity that sometimes comes before the end. "Where is my Miguel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical breathing that kept her alive. "I need to tell him something important before I go." Elena's tears fell onto the hospital blanket as she realized her son was probably passed out drunk somewhere, completely unaware that the woman who had raised him with endless patience and unconditional love was slipping away, still calling his name with her final breaths. Miguel stumbled through the church doors at midnight, seeking solitude rather than solace. The sanctuary stood empty and dark except for the red glow of the eternal flame that somehow still flickered despite everything he had done to defile this sacred space. He collapsed into the front pew where Rosa had sat every Sunday for 60 years, her absence hitting him like a physical blow. The damaged altar stood before him, his boot marks still visible across the base where flowers had once rested in peaceful offering. Then the air around him began to shimmer with an impossible blue light. She appeared slowly, as if stepping through a doorway between worlds. The Virgin Mary stood exactly where her statue had been, but alive, radiant, her robes flowing with celestial wind that touched nothing else in the silent church. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as she spoke, her voice carrying the warmth of every mother's love he had ever rejected. "Miguel, my son," she said, And in those 3 words he heard Rosa's voice, Elena's tears, and a forgiveness so complete it shattered every wall of anger he had built around his broken heart. Your grandmother's prayers have reached heaven. Miguel knelt in the confessional booth for the first time in 15 years, his hands trembling as he faced Father Martinez through the wooden screen. The elderly priest listened in stunned silence as Miguel recounted the midnight visitation, his voice breaking with each impossible detail of Mary's appearance. "Father, I know how this sounds," Miguel whispered, "but she was there, as real as you are now. She spoke about Grandma Rosa's prayers, about forgiveness I don't deserve." The priest was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Miguel. Perhaps your grandmother's faith was stronger than your rebellion." Miguel began returning to the church every morning before dawn, working with his construction tools to repair the altar he had damaged. His calloused hands, once used for destruction, now carefully restored the scratched marble and reset the displaced stones with painstaking precision. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from the shadows at first, suspicious of his motives. But as days passed and Miguel continued his silent labor, she began leaving fresh flowers beside his toolbox. Other parishioners followed, their initial hostility softening into cautious curiosity as they witnessed genuine transformation taking place before their eyes. The first miracle happened on a Tuesday morning as Miguel polished the restored marble base. 7-year-old Sofia Martinez, who had been paralyzed from birth, touched the Virgin Mary statue while her mother prayed desperately for healing. The child's legs suddenly strengthened, and she took her first steps across the sanctuary floor. Father Martinez gasped as he witnessed Sofia walking toward the altar, her tiny hand reaching out to touch the same surface Miguel had once kicked in anger. The child's mother wept with joy, falling to her knees in thanksgiving for the impossible gift. Word spread quickly through the parish and beyond. Mrs. Rodriguez's arthritis disappeared after touching the statue. Old Mr. Garcia's failing eyesight returned to perfect clarity. Each healing occurred while Miguel worked nearby, his presence somehow connected to the miraculous events unfolding in the sacred space. Miguel watched in humble amazement as his grandmother's church became a place of pilgrimage. People traveled from neighboring towns to witness the healings, to touch the statue he had once defiled. The altar he had damaged with hatred now overflowed with offerings of gratitude from families whose prayers had been answered through inexplicable grace. Robert stood in the church doorway watching his son kneel before the altar, tools neatly arranged beside him as he carefully cleaned each surface with reverent attention. The hardened contractor had avoided speaking to Miguel for months, but the undeniable changes in his son's character finally broke through his stubborn pride. "I saw what you did for Martinez family," Robert said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he had suppressed too long. "Building that wheelchair ramp for free, spending your own money on materials." Miguel looked up, surprised to see his father's eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Grandma Rosa always said our hands were meant to build, not destroy, Papa. I finally understand what she meant." Elena watched from the pew as her husband and son embraced for the first time since the desecration. Their shared grief over Rosa's passing had transformed into something healing, a bridge built from forgiveness and witness grace. The family began attending Mass together again, no longer hiding in shame, but sitting proudly in Rosa's favorite pew. Miguel's testimony about his midnight encounter with the Virgin Mary drew skeptics and believers alike, but none could deny the fruits of his transformation. St. Teresa's overflowed with mourners and miracle seekers alike for Rosa's memorial service. Miguel stood at the altar he had once kicked, now restored to gleaming beauty, speaking about his grandmother's unwavering faith that had somehow reached beyond death to save his soul. "She never stopped praying for me," Miguel told the packed sanctuary, his voice steady despite his tears. "Even when I rejected everything she believed, even when I desecrated this sacred place, she held on a hope that love would find a way." Father Martinez watched as former enemies nodded in agreement, moved by Miguel's humble testimony. Mrs. Rodriguez dabbed her eyes, remembering how she had once crossed the street to avoid Elena. Now she sat beside Miguel's mother, their shared witness of divine intervention, creating bonds stronger than old grudges. The bishop himself had come to investigate the reported healings, interviewing witnesses and documenting each miraculous event. As Miguel finished speaking, little Sofia Martinez walked forward and placed a single white rose on Rosa's memorial wreath, her steps a living testament to the power that had transformed their community through one man's encounter with grace. Miguel arrived at the church each morning before sunrise, maintaining the sacred space with the same dedication Rosa had shown through decades of faithful service. Young men from troubled families began seeking him out, drawn by his reputation for understanding rebellion and the path back to redemption. "You think you're too far gone for forgiveness," Miguel told 17-year-old Danny Torres, whose gang involvement had brought shame to his devout family. "I once kicked the Virgin Mary's altar in front of my dying grandmother. If grace can reach someone like me, it can reach anyone." His construction business thrived as word spread about his integrity and craftsmanship. Every project became an opportunity to serve, whether building handicap ramps for elderly parishioners or repairing storm damage at neighboring churches without charge. Elena watched with quiet pride as her son counseled another wayward youth, seeing Rosa's gentle wisdom flowing through Miguel's transformed heart. The family business had become a ministry, their profits funding restoration projects throughout the diocese. Father Martinez often found Miguel kneeling before the altar at night, praying for the young men who sought his guidance. The priest marveled at how completely God had redeemed what seemed irredeemable, turning destruction into devoted service. 5 years later, Miguel led the annual Virgin Mary procession through the streets where he had once stumbled drunk and defiant. The same hands that had kicked the sacred altar now carried the statue with reverent care, his face glowing with the peace that comes from complete surrender to divine grace. Pilgrims traveled from distant cities to hear his testimony and witness the miraculous altar. A skeptical journalist arrived expecting to debunk the healings, but left as a believer after interviewing dozens of witnesses whose lives had been transformed by encounters with the sacred. The family construction business had expanded into a non-profit ministry, building churches and community centers throughout the region. Robert and Miguel worked side by side, their relationship stronger than ever, bonded by shared purpose and witnessed miracles. Elena stood among the crowd watching her son lead the procession, Rosa's rosary beads wrapped around her fingers. She could almost see her mother's spirit walking beside Miguel, her prayers finally answered in ways more beautiful than she had ever dared imagine. If you've experienced grace transforming a broken relationship or witnessed faith healing family divisions, share your story in the comments below. Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The church bells tolled 6 o'clock as Miguel stormed past the cemetery where 4 generations of his family rested in consecrated ground. His steel-toed boots kicked gravel against Rosa's future headstone, already carved and waiting in the monument yard across the street. Elena followed him into the parking lot, her sobs echoing off the adobe walls of St. Teresa's. "Miguel, please," she begged, reaching for his arm as he fumbled with his truck keys. "Your grandmother saw what you did. It's killing her faster than the heart disease." Miguel shrugged off his mother's desperate grasp. Maybe it's time the old woman faced reality. All those years wasted on her knees, praying to a piece of painted plaster. Where was your precious Mary when Dad lost his job? Where was she when the doctors said Grandma was dying? The evening mass crowd gathered on the church steps, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly when Miguel gunned his engine. Father Martinez appeared in the doorway, his face etched with the same shock that had frozen him during the desecration just hours before. Miguel rolled down his window and shouted across the sacred courtyard, "Keep praying, Father. Let me know when your statue starts paying medical bills." Miguel raced through the hospital corridors, the Virgin Mary's words still echoing in his heart as he burst through the door of Rosa's room. Elena looked up from her vigil beside the bed, her eyes red from crying through the longest night of her life. "Grandma," Miguel whispered, falling to his knees beside the hospital bed where Rosa lay motionless, her breathing shallow and labored. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Rosa's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Her weathered hand found his cheek with surprising strength, wiping away tears he didn't realize he was shedding. "Miguel, my precious boy," she whispered. "She came to you, didn't she? I felt her presence in this room just an hour ago." Miguel nodded, unable to speak through his overwhelming grief and wonder. Rosa smiled with the peace of someone whose deepest prayers had finally been answered. "She forgave you before you even asked, just like I forgave you the moment you walked away from that altar." Elena watched in amazement as her mother's breathing grew steady and peaceful. Rosa closed her eyes one final time, her hand still resting on Miguel's face, and passed into eternity surrounded by the love and forgiveness she had spent her lifetime teaching.